Welcome back to episode 2 of the platform discussion. We are the Reform Party, and we are dedicated to electing citizens who want to serve their communities at all levels of government and make accountability, honest leadership, and solutions the cornerstone of their term of service. Joining with me today is Rick, the Platform Committee Chairman and SC Rep.
Hello.
I've got Rich, platform member and the new party secretary. I've got myself, platform member and newly elected vice chair of comms. And we have joining us for the first time, Jim, one of our platform members.
Howdy.
So last time we talked about the level 1 planks, and we kind of said that there's 3 levels to our platform. There's level 1, which is just kind of the simple, easy to read, easy to understand. There's level 2, where we go a little bit further in depth, and then there's level 3, which are going to be written more as essays or policy, like actual policy positions. The goal of the podcast from here on is to really dive into the level 2 planks and kind of talk about, what they are and what we kind of felt about them and how we arrived to those decisions. So, but before we get into that, I'm going to have a quick call for donations. The Reform Party believes in fiscal responsibility, including our own. We seek to resolve problems, including those created by oversized financial influence. We are funded by those who believe in our mission, our principles, and goals are worthy of their support. Nearly all of our support comes from donations of less than $100. Like other volunteer-based organizations, a steady flow of donations, even $5 per month, makes a difference. If what we say resonates with you, go to thereformparty.org and click on contribute. And don't forget to sign up for our mailing list to get involved. So to open up our discussion today, guys, I think we're going to start with fiscal responsibility. We are the party of Perot after all. Think so?
Okay, first level of fiscal responsibility. This is a conversation after all, so I'm just continuing.
Yeah.
Conversation. Fiscal responsibility. The Reform Party promotes and practices fiscal responsibility. We hold all who serve in public office at all levels of government accountable for the conservation and proper use of public resources. That's the high-level, short version, 3 sentences of fiscal responsibility. Then we take it and we break it out deeper into second level. Somebody want to start covering some of that?
Rick, you look like you're primed to read paragraph 4.
I'll jump in there. All right. The federal government should reduce, with the intention of ending, the ongoing cycle of deficit spending and commit to a practice of accountability without loopholes. Reform Party founder Ross Perot identified the already building trend of having the U.S. Treasury issue bonds with proceeds to fund current government operations. Our goal is to end the practice of borrowing against future tax revenues without a clear plan to settle this debt. The federal government should reduce, with the intention of ending, the ongoing cycle of deficit spending and commit to a practice of accountability without loopholes for the benefit of all people of the United States. Reform Party founder Ross Perot identified the already building trend of having the U.S. Treasury issue bonds with proceeds to fund current government operations. Our goal is to end the practice of borrowing against future tax revenues without a clear plan to settle this debt. Although not a typical year, in the fiscal year 2021, the federal government collected $4.05 trillion and spent $6.82 trillion, resulting in a one-year deficit of $2.77 trillion. The total national debt was $1.43 trillion at the end of fiscal year 2021.
The Reform Party promotes careful budgeting, spending control, and a focus of programs that support, improve, and promote the general welfare of communities. To promote accountability, the Reform Party supports the mission of the Government Accounting Office, the GAO, and Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and similar state and local agencies to provide financial audits and reviews that evaluate department and program results against planned outcomes.
Department and program functions should be monitored for adherence to mission and for overlapping mission scopes. Each department should be established with the intention to keep responsibilities and the use of resources transparent. The Reform Party calls for a constitutional amendment that constrains deficit spending. It is necessary to enforce fiscal discipline with consequences that have an impact on every legislative district. The amendment we favor would allow for Congress to declare an emergency before penalties become effective. A national emergency declaration will also delay budgetary penalties. A plan to return to fiscal discipline must be enacted when the emergency declaration expires.
All right. In summary of this stance, it's basically, we're going to talk about the government spending too much money without a plan to recoup what is being spent. And, the Reform Party founder, Ross Perot, really hit on this note in his two presidential runs in the 1990s, in 1992 and 1996. It's a very important business aspect to him that you just don't live beyond your means. And that's basically what we're talking about here as far as our federal fiscal responsibility.
Go ahead, Jim.
We recognize that a pure balanced budget amendment is not practical. Things come up. A recent example being COVID. It was necessary to do something to keep people moving, to keep them supplied with some source of income, with so many places shutting down. Hence, we allow for these declarations. But again, there needs to be a plan in place for when that emergency is over to replenish our supplies, as it were.
Yeah, at least when the emergencies ended, you have to restore the programs to where they started from, or some semblance thereof, and you got to manage that transition. And that's something actually in this current time we're having some challenges with managing the transition back out of the emergency.
I would like to continue that thought about those who have a fear of a balanced budget act. Is basically you have a discretionary spending amount and you have a mandatory spending amount within a federal budget, and basically we would like to fit in some caveats there to make sure that the government doesn't default on paying mandatory expenses in emergency times. So if there was a problem not meeting the requirements of the balanced budget amendment, the mandatory expenditures would be taken care of.
And there's something deeper, within kind of that central part when we start talking about the Government Accounting Office and the Congressional Budget Office. Where are these budget cuts going to come from? And we don't want to be the party of cutting programs. So we have to be the party of efficiency and really incentivizing or driving the government to become more efficient in its operation, right? So that we can balance the budget. We talked about this as to whether or not we really wanted to, call for a constitutional amendment, or if it should just be like a law to be passed. And we kind of opted for the constitutional amendment. So we think that that's kind of a harder target to hit.
We also, Rick used the term, a balanced budget amendment. That's not actually what we're calling for, is it? We've got a constitutional amendment that constrains deficit spending. Because exactly what form that is, whether you have to have a balanced budget every year, if it has to be balanced 4 to 5 years, or whether, balance, there's times where you should have a surplus budget because you have to repay previous debts. So there's a kind of it's not just straight balanced budget, although there are some people that target that specifically.
Yeah.
Something that I think needs to be considered is that any budget needs to take into account projected revenues. And that means reasonable taxation, responsible taxation, and of course, trade policies. But that is covered under a different plank for us.
The next platform plank we're going to discuss is government size and scope. The first level language, the short form version, reads, the Reform Party favors localized government with limited and appropriate oversight. We advocate for government services with a specific mission and scope that is not unduly duplicated by multiple agencies. Programs and services and their administrators should be responsive, available, and accountable. Moving on to the longer form, second level.
Yeah. So for level 2, the Reform Party recognizes that federal and state and local government spending has grown disproportionately in relation to population and productivity. Over the last several decades, federal spending as a share of gross domestic product, GDP, has increased dramatically. Total federal outlays in 2000 were 17.7% of GDP, while in 2022, federal outlays were 25.1% of GDP. Outlays, spending, have exceeded the receipts, the revenue, every year since 2002. And that is a quote from, or that's data from the whitehouse.gov and the cbo.gov.
The scope of government must prioritize efficiency and effectiveness to avoid problems arising from an increasing spending to revenue ratio. 3 points we have here in the platform, second level language. 1, government offices and programs should have sufficient but not excessive resources to perform their mission. 2, oversight of a program should not interfere with the program's mission. Example, state and federal education programs and regulations. 3, mission overlap should be limited. For example, OSHA and the EPA established a Memorandum of Understanding in 1991 to manage circumstances where their jurisdictions overlap. The Reform Party will foster awareness of these concerns, beginning with individual voters and extending to the leaders they elect.
Oh, I wanted to add in the reference there for the Occupational Safety and Health Agency? Is that right for OSHA? And Environmental Protection Agency for EPA. That memorandum comes from the OSHA.gov website.
Yeah, it's so one of the things that this kind of highlights with this plank is, one, the data that we really wanted to look at as we kind of examine certain things, right? Such as, the growth in government spending as compared to GDP, which is, not the be all end all measure of productivity. But is definitely a data point to kind of look at, as well as, this kind of nuanced, element of how OSHA and the EPA try and break up areas where they have overlapping jurisdictions, so that you're not spending a whole bunch of resources, going back over, redundancy essentially.
Looking back at first level language, something we point out there is the importance of localized government. And it's easy to look at the federal government budget because it's much more dramatic, but local government has its own bond issues and debt concerns to be watching as well. And that's where you want to be. If you can't do it right sized locally, you're probably it's going to get worse with the larger scope of state and federal.
And this ties back to our stance on fiscal responsibility. Clearly, if we continue to spend more than what we're bringing in, at some point, it's going to dry up. We can live on a credit card. If we try living on our credit cards, making only minimum payments each month, at some point, the banks are going to say, no more.
I think, kind of getting back to government offices and programs should have sufficient but not excessive resources to perform their mission. I always think of the old adages of, spend it or lose it style programs where, hey, you've got this budget for the year. Either you're going to spend all of that money or you're going to lose it. And, I don't think that any of us here really kind of agree with that. If you don't spend money within a year, right, then that's good overall, but it doesn't mean that next year is going to be the same. It kind of makes this incentive to be, wasteful with government funding because of the fear of what next year is going to bring.
I think that every veteran listening to this understands use it or lose it. That's how our budgets work, at least when I was with the Navy.
Oh yeah,
and any person who works for a company that allocates vacation time as use it or lose it from year to year can recognize the problems inherent in that when that gets applied to a budget.
This approach obviously does not give incentive to be more efficient in order to cut your expenses.
And so that then takes us to that second part, that challenge of oversight. When the government goes to oversee something, it often just makes it so much more complicated, right? So like we really got to solve this issue of how do you provide oversight that doesn't interfere with the mission, and I think to the plight of many educators and all of the hoops that they have to jump through in order to validate their job, right? Or to show that something's happening, right? Like, well, if you don't have a state mandated test, how do we know that people are learning? But then the class winds up being taught to the test. And so you're not, it's interfering with the mission of a holistic education by focusing on taking a multiple choice test. And so it's oversight, but I don't think it's good oversight. Like it's a check in the box. And that's equally problematic and wasteful, honestly.
And related
to write those tests.
And related to that is how do you control the cost of the oversight?
Yeah.
It's quite conceivable that the cost of oversight exceeds the direct expense of the program itself. Because the people doing the oversight want to justify their jobs.
Yeah. And this really will lead us into, I think, another platform plank that we have as well.
Did you want to go straight into legislative processes and lobbying?
No, I don't think, I'm not really thinking with that one, but just the idea where we talk about mission overlap should be limited, right? And where, you know, what a government program does, it doesn't, like, we're concerned with what their mission becomes and how missions evolve and mission creep.
Both of the preceding planks are going to require close monitoring of our legislature's processes and the influence exerted upon them. To that extent, the Reform Party promotes simplicity and transparency in the legislative process and the influences upon it, i.e. lobbying. Proposed bills should adhere to a single theme with minimal addenda. The Reform Party maintains that the legislative process, which creates new laws and regulations, must include regular reviews of existing laws and regulations.
Okay, starting into the second level, a bit more detailed language here. Simplicity and conciseness are the roots of good legislation. Single-themed bills promote transparency by improving understanding of their intent. Unnecessary complications, often introduced by outside interests, for example, professional lobbyists, can serve hidden agendas.
A legislator's priorities should come from constituents in their district and state, not outside interest. Lobbyist influence in legislative development may raise concerns regarding a representative's honorable service to their constituents. Misguided intent can be obscured by bill complexity. To preserve ethics, each bill's purpose and contents should be clearly named in its title. For example, a budget bill should not contain changes to voting processes. Sources and contributing authors should be named in a document that accompanies all bills. Inappropriate influence. An entity should not be allowed to contribute to the campaign of a legislator or the promotion of a ballot measure in a district or state where they do not have presence or activity. The Reform Party encourages monitoring and transparency of political campaign receipts and expenses. We support the mission statement of the U.S. Office of Government Ethics. Public service is a public trust, requiring employees to place loyalty to the Constitution, the laws, and ethical principles above private gain. And that's coming directly from the U.S. Office of Government Ethics.
The Reform Party believes that the legislation that governs the people should be understood by the people. For this purpose, bills in every legislative body should focus on a single theme/purpose and contain minimal addenda. We believe a review process should exist in all jurisdictions to evaluate and recommend the removal of laws whose missions are outdated or have been shown to be ineffective. Each governing body should consciously remove laws and any budget needs that no longer benefit their constituents. The Reform Party holds that trust and transparency are critical components of a responsible and representative government. We promote a legislative process that is accessible and understandable by all.
So I feel like this was another really major stance for us.
Yes.
I mean, just by kind of its sheer size, it's definitely one of the bigger ones. I think a personal favorite for me in here was asking that the sources and contributing authors of a bill be named in the document, or be named in a document that accompanies the bill. You know.
Oh yes, and for me, it's that.
Go ahead, Jim.
And for me, one of the big ones is, of course, the first bullet point under inappropriate influence, that ideally donations can only come from parties that are eligible to vote in a given race or campaign.
Actual constituents, not people from outside the area.
Right.
or a given elected position.
Right. Ideally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of these are, you get towards, what you say, better governance becomes a little bit more a matter of local control, and you start losing local control when some entity elsewhere starts paying for campaigns,
Yeah.
and the person who's working within just the local resources is put at a disadvantage.
Yeah. Now, what's not stated but implied is that if we were to actually say only eligible voters in a given race or ballot measure can donate, that automatically means that corporations cannot donate because corporations cannot vote.
Yes. There are, well, this is how this becomes a bigger issue than what we could put on paper here.
Right, but I'm just saying that is the implication that some people might pick up on.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I like the idea of reducing complexity and the single theme thing. I don't know what could be done to reasonably enforce that, other than, kind of a informal or formal policy that's repeated.
Right.
It might take an amendment on that as far as federal level goes.
That was a matter of discourse with certain political groups more recently.
Yes.
The topic's come up time and again.
Okay. Something that comes to mind for me is the relative amount of fog that we have as voters as to how the process is really working and whether it's working well or not. Determining what bills come to the floor, determining what the bill should look like before it comes to the floor of the House, determining, having the reviews by the Congressional Budget Office, things like that, the inputs, how well are those processes working? And that's the one that I think is the most front of mind, is the U.S. House of Representatives. But these things take place in every legislative body, from your county legislature on up. So similar thing, who decides when it's time to come into the meeting and when it's time to be tabled or actually resolved and voted and this sort of thing. And I think a lot of voters, myself included, are not real clear on how that works.
A good place to bring up my pet peeve of spending bills being put in the reconciliation process. Or is that too much collegiate type educational language?
No, that's fine. It's just to say it's an open issue. If we go to explore it, that's kind of like its own topic for its own podcast. But to say that's something that needs to be, or we desire to explore, or I wish I knew more about it, I would say that's fine.
Our spending bills, we actually haven't had one presented the proper way since like 2002. During the Bush years, every one of them, they get into some sort of, battle about this, that, and the other, and both sides agree, put it into what's called reconciliation, where the shell bill is introduced and then content is then amended to it. Unfortunately, it goes into a 72-hour rule, and it's towards the end of the 72 hours where they keep adding more stuff, and nobody reads it because they don't have enough time before the floor vote to actually go through, hundreds of pages that had just added to it 2 hours ago.
And probably the most egregious example of that was Obamacare and Harry Reid.
Yeah, and that's why Nancy Pelosi was quoted saying that we have to pass it to find out what's in it, because they didn't have the time to read it.
Was that because of the things that were added during that reconciliation period?
That's
Okay.
because we couldn't get it done because normally it would take a 60% vote to pass, a 60% approval vote. But when you go into reconciliation, it only needs 50%. That's why it comes down to the 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans being so important, because they keep putting everything into reconciliation instead of actually doing it for
Something we want to make sure we point out in our discussions. Although we are reading the Reform Party platform directly as it was passed by our convention, and that part is, completely straight. We are adding commentary of our own, and sometimes if something's unclear, confused, or if there's a mistake, if we got something wrong, let us know, because that's one of the things that we want to make sure we're accurate, or as accurate as you reasonably can be. We try to stay responsible for the things we say. So it's always with the intent of being true, factual, all this. But if we make a mistake, please let us know, because we want to make sure we correct ourselves.
So that concludes this week's topics. Next week, we're going to go over social and cultural issues, healthcare, and public education. We're going to step full into things that the Reform Party was not necessarily known for. So be sure to join us then. And you can find us on reformparty.org.
Come join us. Come on.